shown that nowadays more and more people have gut issues and autoimmune issues. And I've seen actually for inflammatory reasons, some people will take CBD oil. It's becoming kind of a new thing nowadays. And you talk about that a little bit in the book, as well as adaptogens and different recovery methods. Could you go into that? Because I think CBD oil is kind of newer for a lot of people.
Yeah, that one's taken off, right?
Yeah.
So there's two cannabinoid receptors. One CBD, there was the cannabinoid receptor 1 and receptor 2. The CBD oil only binds to 2, so you don't have any of the psychogenic, psychoactive effects there that you'll get from marijuana. But there's a decent amount of animal work, and I cover this in the book, looking at the analgesic effects and anti-inflammatory effects. They haven't ironed out all these pathways.
Right.
Some of them involve NF-kappa beta, if I'm remembering correctly, and COX enzymes. But and you see things like reduction in inflammation at the joints when they've created like rheumatoid arthritis models in rodents, but also you can get sort of a systemic effect even with just like a transdermal application.
Yeah.
So it's funny because it's new and novel, people are like, oh, this is cool. We like to play with new things. I don't blame them, you know. And there's potential sleep benefits, that sort of thing from the CBD oil. I actually tried a product that I was given. I mentioned this on the Muscle Minds podcast. You may have heard this. I don't know.
Oh, I don't know if I heard that one.
Yeah, I had an adverse effect. It may have been totally in my head. I didn't have the sense I was expecting this, but I had, when I was years ago, when I was in Amsterdam, so this was totally legal.
Yeah.
I had some space cakes and I did not have a good, experience at all. It was awful. Really, really bad. Could have been laced. Could have been too much. I'm not sure. But me and THC don't seem to get along from what I've been able to figure out. And so I shouldn't have had any issues with this. It was a little gummy bear product. And according to their label claims, it was completely pure, 100% CBD oil, blah, 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 which I kind of find almost hard to believe. It was like a perfect, label, but I took it and I got anxiety. I had this sense of kind of claustrophobia, high anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. I may be an outlier. I'm not sure. But a lot of people are finding those other benefits may be there, and anything that can reduce our stress is probably a good thing. But what I don't know, and some of this is my lack of knowledge because I haven't dug into this. It's one of those bodies of literature that's kind of scattered all over the place, and a lot of animal work and even some in vitro stuff, is exactly what the anti-inflammatory actions are, exactly what's going on. With the second messenger system and the signaling when you're binding the cannabinoid receptors, at least in terms of CBD. So the thing that I mentioned, and I think this kind of applies globally, and this would depend somewhat upon what mechanisms are in effect here, is that when we're talking about training, we're talking about stimuli that promote adaptation. The whole point is to have stress. We're creating inflammation. We're creating an inflammatory stress.
Right.
And I have a big section on hormesis and the hormetic stimulus. And this is the idea of sort of an inverse U phenomenon where you can kind of optimize the amount of stress to give the best stimulus to promote an adaptation. In this case, we're thinking muscle growth.
Right.
And if you fall on either side of that optimal level, you don't get an optimal adaptation. So you have too much stress, you don't get an adaptation. It's basically degradative. It would break down. You would not recover from that. The stress is excessive. The free radical stress is too high. There's too much inflammation. And you see this, for instance, when you give like antioxidants, like megadosing vitamin C and vitamin E.
Right.
You can prevent the adaptations in skeletal muscle in terms of insulin sensitivity, mitochondrial biogenesis, those sorts of things, because there's something about that free radical stress.
Right.
And I mean, literally, when you have increased oxidative phosphorylation, you're producing superoxide radicals. Like every time you increase the energy demand, energy supply in a cell, in a muscle cell, you produce free radicals. It's almost like the free radicals it's like the heat coming off the engine.
Right.
And that heat is part of the signal that says, okay, we need to make this engine better, by producing more mitochondria in this particular example. Yeah. So if you give vitamin C, like a gram of vitamin C and 400 IUs of vitamin E, around that exercise time, you can blunt that free radical stress, and then you blunt the exercise adaptation.
Right, right.
Same thing seems to hold with non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, but there's a study that Trappy did at Ball State, which is pretty cool, with older folks. Mm. But they actually found giving a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, there was increased muscle.
Right.
Yeah. And my guess is that some of that has to do with, they broke it down into some biological mechanisms, but some of it I think probably has to do with optimizing the hormetic stress, such that older folks are more, some of what the loss of strength and muscle mass with aging is due to age per se, and some of it's due to inactivity.
Yeah.
Maybe 50-50. It's hard to know exactly. Probably, obviously, depends on the person, how much they've lost. But older muscle is more susceptible to muscle damage. So if you could limit the damage-induced inflammation, right, you could optimize the growth, and that's what it seemed like happened there. And I can't remember. I have so many conversations. I mix up whether they're on a podcast or not.
Yeah, right.
I think this was actually just someone I was chatting with the other day. An old school powerlifter told me years ago, one of the things they used to do, when you get close to a meet, they'd have like 2 or 3 weeks out, like their last crazy training day. And these guys would meet in the gym, like block the gym off and crank the heavy metal and just go to town and do just heavy singles of squats and deads. We're talking like 18, 20 heavy singles, stuff that would just destroy you.
Right.
Like sore everywhere, but they would load up on aspirin. They take like a handful of aspirin beforehand to try to blunt all that inflammation. And that way they reduced the blunt trauma, so to speak, brought on by all those high intensity contractions, reduced the inflammation, but they got the neurological practice effect. So they got to get away with doing 20 singles and just be knuckleheads too, which is partly what they wanted to do. So, for them, all that training would have been excessive, especially if they're trying to put on muscle mass. They weren't caring so much about that at that point in time.
Right.
But they needed to do that, to basically shift the stress, the hormetic stress, into something that was more reasonable. So load up on the anti-inflammatories because they loaded up on the training. Both were in excess, but they balance one another, so to speak. So back to CBD oil. That's my thought there is, I mean, there are not a lot of people who say, man, I started taking aspirin and my gains just went away.
Right.
It's not an obvious effect. It's almost like a theoretical one and one you might look into for someone who's not making progress in the way they want to.
Yeah.
Like one of my pet topics that I'm thinking more and more about now is muscle soreness, because I tend to be sore a lot.
Right.
We can talk about that if you want to, but
yeah.
If someone, for instance, is using a lot of CBD oil to the point where they're having like no pain and they don't seem to be making progress, that's something I might look at. It's like, well, you're blunting. If you're preventing inflammation, you may be preventing the stimulus that you're trying to evoke with the training. Maybe undoing the whole point of the training. Training's fun, it may be your therapy or what have you, but from a muscle growth standpoint, if you're undoing the biological stimulus of the exercise, then you're going to undo the adaptation at the same point.